I should say, actually, I've really been looking forward to this presentation by Joel tonight. I've been looking forward to it all year. And now, my favorite part, as I was going to say, where Joel captures your attention while I have the refreshment table all to myself.
Well, thank you, Robert. As Robert mentioned, we at the Center, we don't belong to any particular religious tradition, but we draw on the teachings of the mystics of all the various traditions. And so before we get into this talk, before I get into this talk, it's important to understand what we mean by mystics and mysticism. And one of the things we don't mean is psychics, healers, channelers, that whole broader definition, and people often use mysticism to cover all those things. Oh, wonderful. Now let's see. I'm sorry, we're going to stop and check my cameraman. Is this...
We have a continuity problem here.
Well, you filmed it coming in, right? Should I start again? Can you see my face?
It's fine, thanks.
So anyway, we need to understand before we begin what we at the Center mean by mystics and mysticism. As I said, we don't mean this, we don't use it in that broad sense of including anything that's a little woo-wee or whatever. We use it in a quite narrow, restricted sense. We could call it the classic mystics, as defined by scholars like Houston Smith and so forth, people who study the traditional mystics. And more specifically, we use it to mean men and women from different times, different places, different traditions, but all who have claimed to attain direct, unmediated knowledge of ultimate reality. Whatever that tradition calls it, and some traditions call it God, or Brahman, or Buddha nature, or Tao, whatever the local term is, the key here is that these people have said there's a way to know this directly. In our culture today, a popular term for this is enlightenment. How many of you heard of the term enlightenment? You know, we don't mean the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, the burst of rationalism and all that. But whatever our term is, each tradition has one or more technical terms for this. So just as an example, both the Hindus and the Buddhists who use Sanskrit texts use the term jnana. In Taoism, it's called Ming, usually translated as illumination. The Tibetan Buddhists call it yeshes. In Zen, it's Kensho or Satori. The Sufis, who are the mystics of Islam, call it Marifa. And the ancient Greeks and early Christians called it Gnosis, which is the way I'm using it in the title of my talk, What is Gnosis? Interesting, Gnosis is spelled G-N-O-S-I-S, and etymologically it's actually related in the Indo-European root to jnana, the Sanskrit, which is J-N-A-N-A. So the J-N-A and the G-N-O share the same deep root, for those of you interested in etymology and stuff like that. In any case, the other thing is that the way I use Gnosis is not quite the same as it's applied to that early movement in Christianity of the Gnostics, who were considered by what became the Orthodox Church heretics and so forth. In my opinion, I'm not a scholar or historian or anything, in my opinion, some of the works of those people reflected the way I use the term gnosis, and some not. Some had very dualistic doctrines and so forth. So I'm not talking about any particular historical period. I'm using the term in a more generic sense. If you know the Gospels, there's a line where Jesus says, "Know the truth and it shall make you free." The Gospels were written in ancient Greek, and that know, the use of the term know there is a root of gnosis. So in Greece, this was the highest form of knowledge. So that's the way I'm using it here. So then the question is, what is this enlightenment or this gnosis? And unfortunately, we can't say. Because it's a direct, unmediated form of knowledge of reality, it's different from all our ordinary ways of knowing. So it's really best to start by explaining what it ain't. At least we won't be barking up the wrong tree, and then at the end we'll try to get some handle of what it is, and you'll see on the way why we can't really say what it is. But in our culture, we have three standard ways of knowing that the whole culture recognizes, if I can perhaps oversimplify it. The one is conceptual knowledge, which we get through reasoning. One is empirical or experiential knowledge, which we get through the senses. And one is scientific knowledge, which we get through sort of a combo of those two. We might recognize other forms of knowledge like intuition. Personally, you might say that this is an important factor in your life. I know it is in mine, but you can't go to a court of law and appear as a witness and say, well, my intuition is that that person's guilty. It won't wash because the whole society doesn't recognize it as valid knowledge. But conceptual knowledge, experiential knowledge, and scientific knowledge, the society does. So let's first talk about conceptual knowledge, which we get through reasoning. And the purest form of that is mathematics. So, for example, in Euclid's geometry, you can prove something called the Pythagorean Theorem. How many of you remember the Pythagorean Theorem from high school or college? Who can give it to me? Yes, go ahead.
The square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the two sides.
Great, that's just what I have written down.
A right triangle.
Of a right triangle, yes, it's got to be a right triangle. Very good, okay. What was that?
Someone said the right triangle, and I said not to be picky.
Not to be picky, right.
In Euclidean space.
Yes, that's what it said. In Euclidean geometry, yes, which means Euclidean space. Now, that means starting from Euclid's axioms, you can prove logically that this is the case. You don't have to go out and measure anything. You don't have to rely on sensory experience. And it will be the case in any Euclidean space, anywhere in the universe, as long as it's Euclidean space. It'll work. Now, you can go measure afterwards, and it'll always work. But you don't even need to do that. We just prove it through logic alone, which in itself is kind of interesting and quite powerful. But it is not Gnosis. You do not get Gnosis through any sort of logical, intellectual proof. Yes?
Where did the axioms come from?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not going to go into that tonight. But it's true that one of the problems, or one of the differences of intellectual knowledge, even this purest form of mathematics, they do rely on axioms. And axioms are not written in stone. As we know in mathematics, actually you can change the axioms and you come up with different sorts of geometries. And we're going to get a little bit to the relativity of that in a moment. In any case, it is not Gnosis, and you cannot prove Gnosis or the reality that you have knowledge of through Gnosis by any sort of mathematical, logical means. So, for instance, here's what the Hindu Upanishads say of Brahman. Brahman's their term for the ultimate reality. He comes to the thought of those who know him beyond thought, not to those who imagine he can be attained by thought. Here's the Buddhist Lokamatara Sutra, and this is what it says about enlightenment. Enlightenment is an exalted state of inner attainment, which transcends all dualistic thinking, and which is above the mind system with its logic, reasoning, theorizing, and illustrations. And here's the Christian mystic Dionysius the Areopagan, and here's what he says of God. That one which is beyond all thought is inconceivable by all thought. So we're talking about some form of knowledge here that is beyond thought, beyond concepts, beyond words. And notice, I read you from 3 different mystics from 3 different traditions, and if we wanted to be here all night, I could have read from all the traditions. I could give you many, many more examples. I encourage you to go read on your own and see if what I'm saying makes sense. But this is one of the things that all mystics agree on. Now, the reason that this is beyond thought is because the reality that Gnosis discloses is a non-dual reality. But thoughts, words, concepts, in their very nature create distinctions, and that creates dualities. So, as I like to say, and some of you have heard this example before, all I have to do is name this object glasses, and it distinguishes it from everything that is not glasses. So in the simple act of naming, of using a word, I'm creating a duality right there. And the more words I use, I create more dualities, multiplicities. Just through that act. Now, notice there's nothing wrong with that. That's what words are supposed to do. They're supposed to clarify the situation for us. If there was no distinction, if I talked about glasses and there was no difference between glasses and a podium or the clock or something, you wouldn't know what I'm talking about. So there's nothing wrong just in the act of making distinctions. But when we make these distinctions, we are creating dualities. This is why the Sufi poet Rumi says, that oneness is on the other side of descriptions and states. Nothing but duality enters speech's playing field. It's a lovely way of putting it. Speech's playing field. And it gives it a sense of speech being playful and thoughts being playful. But they all depend on duality. And when we get to formal thinking, when we get to logic, of course, making a distinction is the foundation of logic. It's called the law of the excluded middle. How many people have heard of that? You're the only one who's heard of the law of the excluded middle. You've heard of this. Something is either A or not A. That's as simple as that. And logic depends on that. We got to know what we're talking about. It's either true or it's false. So that's the basis of our logical reasoning. But mystics of all traditions claim. Now notice I'm always prefacing this by saying claim. I'm qualifying it. I'm not saying it's necessary. I do think it's true. I believe it's true. I see it's true. But I'm not asking you at this point to believe it's true. I'm just informing you of what the mystics claim. They claim all distinctions are imaginary. These are simple, everyday distinctions, like the glasses and the podium here. Here's what the Lokamvatara Sutra says. False imagination teaches that such things as light and shade, long and short, black and white, are different and are to be discriminated, but they are not independent of each other. They are only different aspects of the same thing. They are terms of relation, not of reality. All duality is falsely imagined. So we're not talking about some fancy hypothetical philosophical thing here. We're talking about the dualities that we're familiar with, light and dark, black and white, and so forth. Here's the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. If we will see things truly, they are strangers to goodness, truth, and everything that tolerates any distinction. They are intimates of the one that is bare of any kind of multiplicity and distinction. And the Hindu mystic Shankara says simply, whatever you see as duality is unreal. So now let's stop for a minute because we want to get some sense of the radicalness of this. This is important. This doesn't sound right. Something's got to be wrong. But I just read you from a Buddhist, from a Christian, and from a Hindu who did not read each other or study each other, I can guarantee. So wherever they're getting this from, it's some other place. They're not just, passing on some obscure doctrine here. And here comes the problem. It's not in making the distinctions. If we didn't make distinctions, we wouldn't have language. We wouldn't have logic. We wouldn't have reasoning. It's that we mistake these imaginary distinctions to be real. In other words, we create them in our minds, we distinguish things, we break it up, and we project it onto our experience, and then we forget that it's imaginary. We take them to be real, and suddenly the world is locked into a rigid grid of distinctions that our language, our culture, our thoughts have created. One of the interesting ways you can sort of examine this and play with this is to go either read about or meet people from very different cultures. Not just, somebody from France or something, but from third world cultures, indigenous people who break up the world in very different ways. And they have different sets of distinctions, and then the world appears to them in that set of distinctions. I know a woman who was staying in a house where a Tibetan Lama was staying in California, and they were walking along the beach, and he suddenly got very excited, and he said, and he started picking up stones. He says, these stones don't want to be here. And he started putting them in his robe and carrying them off to some other place. And, this was to her bizarre behavior, but it wasn't bizarre to him. So it's this mistaking the distinction to be real is the problem. Otherwise, language is a playing field, as Rumi says. If we don't mistake it to be real, it's fun, it's great, it's poetry. But when we mistake it to be real, the technical term is we reify it. That's where mystics say we run into trouble. Now, to give you an idea of the problem here, the depth of the problem here, I've just been talking about non-duality, and the ultimate reality is non-dual. You notice a lot of these mystics talked about the one. It's a very common universal way of mystics talking about the one. But even to say ultimate reality is non-dual is going too far, because it creates a distinction between duality and non-duality, and that distinction is imaginary. So if we focus on that, we're right back in duality. So we can't even really say that non-duality is the nature of ultimate reality. This is what gives rise to these paradoxical teachings and statements that mystics are famous for. And I'll just give you one example from the great Buddhist sage philosopher Nagarjuna. And here's what he says. Everything is true, nothing is true. Everything is both true and not true. Everything is neither true nor not true. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So in case you think you're going to figure this out, just quit right now. I mean, give it up. Let it go. It cannot be figured out. It cannot be arrived at logically. So the second common way we think knowledge is acquired is through experience. We call it technically empirical knowledge. So loosely speaking, I grew up in New York. So if you ask me, do you know New York? I say, oh yeah, I know New York very well. You can tell, I grew up in New York, right? And so what I mean is, I didn't just read about New York in some travel book, the way I read about London. I've never been to London, but I've read about London, and I know there's the theater district and all that, but I don't really know London experientially. I have actual experience. That's what I mean when I say experiential knowledge. And you will find if you read through the mystical texts, they often talk about Gnosis as though it were an experience. They'll say things like, you have to experience this for yourself. But strictly speaking, it's not experience. It's closer to experience because it is more immediate. It's not mediated by language, although that's the other question, how much of our experience is really mediated by our thoughts and language and so forth. But it's not experience the way we mean it in a strict sense. And one of the reasons is because experiences are ephemeral. They fade with time. So, and perhaps you've had the same experience. I went back to New York with my wife in 2000, and she'd never been to New York. I hadn't been to New York in 30 years, maybe 30 years. And I took her back, and I took her to my old neighborhood, and I grew up right next to Little Italy, and I took her to Mulberry Street that used to be loaded with, Italian restaurants, and you would hear the Italian language in the streets and all that. Well, it's gone. It's gone. And right around the corner is a street named Hester Street. I don't know if you've ever heard of Hester Street. Before the Italians got there, it was a famous street where Jewish immigrants congregated. And we went around the corner, and it's Japanese. It's grocery stores. The signs are in Japanese. This isn't like a Japanese town for tourists. I mean, these are immigrant Japanese, right? Speaking Japanese in the streets. I mean, it was like, totally gone, totally changed. So our experiences are always ephemeral. They're always changing. Our experiential knowledge is always changing. We think we know something, and then, a little while later, we realize we don't know it. It's changed on us, moved ahead. But the truth revealed by Gnosis, according to the mystics, does not change, does not fade. Here, for instance, is the Tibetan Buddhist master Tsoknyi Rinpoche. And he says, when and how one achieves enlightenment is an individual thing. But once you see through to the very root cause of confusion and are totally free from it, falling back is not possible. It is important to know this. So again, this sounds, wait a minute, this can't be right. I mean, how could you have that kind of certainty? This isn't the certainty of faith. This is something else. Faith you can always doubt. You could be, completely a believer in some religion, and then something could come along and you lose it all. Here's what the Hindu mystic Anandamoya Ma says. She was a great mystic of the 20th century. You must seek that which will take you to the state of undifferentiated being, of oneness, where nothing remains to be known or to be attained. And then Rumi writes, in his poetic way, no ripe grape ever becomes green. No mature fruit ever again becomes raw. So, Gnosis is not experience. Something else than experiential knowledge. So then the third way in our culture we think of knowledge as being attained is through the scientific method. Get scientific knowledge. And I'm sure most of you know that that's a combination of intellectual knowledge, theories, and experiential knowledge, experiments. So we have theories, and then we test them against our experience, our experiments, observations, and if they pan out, we say, oh, this is good knowledge, this is valid knowledge. If they don't, we drop that theory, and we go on, and we make up another theory and test that one. Very powerful, isn't it? I mean, it's just incredible what that method, that kind of approach to knowledge has given us, and we see the results of it all around us. We're not necessarily sure it's all going to work out okay, because it brings us almost as many problems as problems it solves, but nevertheless, there's no question of the power of it. But Gnosis is not to be derived from scientific knowledge, from theories and experiments. And one of the things is that no matter how accurate a scientific theory appears, no matter how useful it is in a certain period of time, they change. They are relative. They are not absolute. I call them the theories du jour, You can see this most immediately when you, as I do, follow nutritional theories. I don't, pay that much attention to them because I'm amused by it. If you like eggs and then they come on television, you read in the paper, well, they've done these studies, eggs are terrible for you, they're going to clog your arteries, you're going to drop dead and all that, and you don't want to give up your eggs, don't worry about it. Wait about 3 years, and a new study will come along and says, well, we were actually wrong about that. Eggs are actually pretty good for you. It's orange juice that's the big killer, Have you had that experience? But I got to tell you, even at a deeper level, even at the level of the foundations of science, things change. So in the 20th century, relativity and classical and quantum mechanics replaced classical mechanics as the foundations of physics, and physics is the foundations of all of science. So in the last 110 years here, we've seen a revolution, a major revolution, right in the foundations of science. So they're relative. They can and they will change. But Gnosis as mystics claim, is not relative. It's absolute and it's eternal. And here's just one expression of this from Zen master Hakuin. And he says, "Then the breakthrough suddenly comes, and with that spiritual seekers penetrate their own nature, the nature of others, the nature of sentient beings, the nature of evil passions, and of enlightenment itself. The great matter of their religious quest is completely and utterly resolved. There is nothing left." So this is closely related to this thing that it's permanent, that it's not impermanent. You can't lose it. But it's important that we note this, particularly in terms of science, because a lot of people today associate enlightenment, and if you want to use the term more loosely, it's perfectly fine, but it's not the way I'm using it, and it's not the way I'm using Gnosis. They associate it with having a new world view, or a paradigm shift. If I shift my paradigm, that's equivalent to enlightenment. But all paradigms, all worldviews are basically conceptual structures, even if they're founded on a scientific method. So Gnosis is not any sort of conceptual structure. Beyond all that. And the biggest difference between Gnosis and ordinary ways of knowing is that our three ordinary ways of knowing are based on, or presume, and we don't even think about it, we just assume it's the case, a distinction between knower and known, subject and object. So this applies whether it's experiential knowledge or intellectual knowledge. I mean, I know New York, I think, or I did know New York. There's a difference. There's me and then there's New York. And so there's a knower and a known. Even intellectual knowledge. The Pythagorean Theorem, in a certain sense, is objective to me. There was a time when I didn't know it, and then I learned it in school, and then I forgot it. And then when I started, doing these studies about worldviews and stuff like that, I ran across it again and I relearned it. And if I get Alzheimer's, I'll forget it again. So there's a knower and a known, even an intellectual level. And perhaps this is the most critical mark of Gnosis. The mystics say that what Gnosis reveals is that even, and especially we might say, this distinction between subject and object is imaginary. It doesn't really exist. Here's the Lakamatara Sutra, says about enlightenment. It is not comparable to the perceptions attained by the sense mind. Neither is it comparable to the cognition of the discriminating and intellectual mind. Both of these presuppose a difference between self and not self. You can't say it more broadly than that. Self and world, that distinction, according to the mystics, is imaginary. It doesn't really, truly exist. Here's Anandamoyama again. She says, what does this direct perception of that mean? Seer, seeing, seeing, where these three are realized as modifications created by the mind, superimposed on the all-pervading consciousness. And by the way, consciousness is another pretty universal term in the various languages for this ultimate reality, this one. But what she's saying is that Gnosis is this realization that the distinction between seer, seeing, and seeing is not real, it's imaginary, and we superimpose it on consciousness, on our experience. And then, again, we reify it. We forget that it is imaginary, we take it to be real, and suddenly, boom, we are stuck. Here I am, stuck in this little body, separate from the rest of the world. And then that causes all sorts of suffering and conflict and so forth. This is why this Gnosis is personally important. It's not just some philosophical thing. So, Gnosis, this is the key thing. Gnosis shows that this distinction is not real. Now, if Gnosis is not derivable through concepts, through experience, and through scientific knowledge, then what is it? What can we say about it? And because words create distinctions, strictly speaking, we can't say anything. And this is actually the meaning of mysticism. It comes from the Greek root mustes, which means mute. It's also the root of our term mute. It cannot be spoken. And if you read through the mystics of all the traditions, they say things like, Teresa of Avila says, everything I say falls short of the truth, which is indescribable. But mystics, of course, have used words, and that's why they're, we have a library at the center there with hundreds of volumes written by mystics. The Lao Tzu was the founder of Taoism, started the Tao Te Ching with a little verse that says, the Tao which can be, he made a pun, by the way, the Tao which can be Taoed, which can be spoken, because Tao also means to speak. The Tao which can be Taoed is not the true Tao. The Tao which can be put to words is not the true Tao. And then he went on to write 81 verses about what you can't talk about. So, but mystics are very aware that they're using words, as the Buddhists say, as fingers pointing to the moon. The words are not it, but they are trying to point to something, to use it. And as the Buddhists always warn, don't mistake the finger for the moon. So what are some of the common words that have been used to try to give us a hint of what Gnosis might be like, some positive terms? So I'm just going to mention a few here. One is realization. I just mentioned Ananda Moyamai talked about the realization, that the distinction between knower, the seer, seen, and seen is superimposed on consciousness and so forth. Realization or recognition. And this gives us it captures the kind of sudden shift in perspective that Gnosis brings about. Something like a Gestalt Shift, those who are familiar with Gestalt psychology and so forth. In the Hindu tradition, they have a very famous ancient metaphor for this, and they say it's like you're walking along a path in the twilight perhaps, and you suddenly see a snake coiled by the side of the road. And you stop and you jump back, and then you look again and you see, oh, it's just a piece of coiled rope. But your mind had projected on it a snake. And the way to discover the truth isn't to figure it out logically. It's not to go over necessarily and touch it. You just suddenly, your perception shifts. And oh, what was a snake is now a rope. So it's this sudden, this recognition. You just recognize, oh, it's a rope. You just realize it's a rope. So that's one word you'll run across a lot. My teacher, Franklin Merrill Wolff, who was an American mystic of the 20th century, used to call it knowledge through identity as a technical term for it. And of course, it shows up in other traditions in the teachings of the mystics. The Hindu Lali Shori says, for instance, for a long time I wept and cried out for Shiva. I searched before me and behind me, above and below. But when at last I found him, I saw that he was not different from me. And Meister Eckhart, the Christian mystic, says, some simple people think that they will see God as if he were standing there and they here. It is not so. God and I, we are one. So this idea of identity, you're knowing your own true nature, your own self. Another common one is union with the divine. And the Hindu Upanishads describe it this way. As when rivers flowing towards the ocean find their final peace, their name and form disappear, even so the wise become free from name and form and enter into the radiance of the Supreme Spirit, who is greater than all greatness. In truth, who knows God becomes God. Here's the Sufi, Abdullah Ansari of Herat. The raindrop reached the sea and found therein its mellowing. Just as the star was effaced by daylight, whoever reaches his Lord and Master has attained his true self. And Teresa of Avila says about the end of her path, here it is like rain falling from the heavens into the river of spring. There is nothing but water there, and it is impossible to divide or separate the water belonging to the river from that which fell from the heavens. Notice how similar these are, these descriptions. Again, these are mystics from different times, different places, different cultures, but the same metaphors occur to them. The idea of the drops melting into the river, to the water, the rivers running into the ocean. Same metaphors. But perhaps the most universal is the metaphor of awakening. And this is what Rumi writes. The pillar of this world, O beloved, is heedlessness. Wakefulness is this world's bane. Wakefulness comes from that world. When it prevails, this world is laid flat. This world of illusion that we live under when we mistake these distinctions to be real. The Upanishads say of Brahman, he is known in the ecstasy of an awakening which opens the door of life eternal. And Chuang Tzu, the Taoist, says, only when one experiences a great awakening does one realize that reality is but a big dream. And of course, this is what happened to the Buddha. He was not always the Buddha. He was Prince Siddhartha, and he went on a quest, and he spent 6 years doing all these practices, ascetic practices, and finally he sat down under the Bodhi tree, and he woke up to the truth. And Buddha means the awakened one. That's why he's called the Buddha. He's the awakened one. So these are some of the terms that we can use. Realization, recognition, union with the divine, knowledge through identity, awakening. These are common terms you'll find in mystical literature, but again, they are fingers pointing to the moon. So, I got to end by saying, however, that this, in a way, sounds rather discouraging. If you think, well, gee, I can't get this through conceptual knowledge, I can't get this through experience, I can't get this through science, how can I get it? And the mystics of all traditions say, you can get it, but you must realize it for yourself. You're not going to get it from any book, you're not going to get it from anybody else's awakening, you're not going to get it any other place. You have to look to yourself. And I think Shankara sums this up the best. He says, from the lips of your teacher, you have learned the truth of Brahman as it is revealed in the scriptures. Now you must realize that truth directly and immediately. Then only will your heart be free from doubt. And this is a key thing that separates mystics from ordinary believers, who might say, well, what you need to do is you need to believe. You need to believe this doctrine, this book, this Bible, this scripture, or whatever, and that's it. All you need to do is believe it. Mystics say that's not enough. And in fact, if you stop with belief, it becomes an obstacle. Oh, so now you believe it. You believe what the mystics say, great. But all the mystics say, no, don't stop there. You go see for yourself. The Buddha's famous for talking about how you have to test what I say like a goldsmith tests gold. And that's why all mystical traditions have practices to aid in that realization. Practices of meditation, of contemplative prayer, of inquiry, things like that. And that's why we call the Center for Sacred Sciences the Center for Sacred Sciences. There's a parallel. Just as science has theories that you can verify through experiments, mystics have teachings that you can verify for yourself through these practices. And how that happens is the subject of a whole another talk. So I think I will just bring it to a close right here. And if you have any questions or comments, the floor is open. Yes?
I think we kind of assume that experience is perhaps we could say belongs to some objective reality that when we experience it, we get that. But if we look at it a little closer, we see that experience, whatever we're experiencing, does not have meaning in itself, but we are overlaying it with meaning. We're giving it all the meaning it has.
Yes, and there's an academic term for that, theory-laden, that all experience is theory-laden. And this is a big issue in academia today. How can we even rely on our experience when people from other cultures have different experiences based on the way they view the world? And if all our experience is mediated through our views of the world, what does it mean to have a truly objective experience? So, and this is a big subject of study and research, and actually people have done all sorts of experiments. A recent one I read about was a study of Chinese students versus American students. And I've forgotten the details of the study, but what they showed was because of the cultures, Chinese students tend to focus on the background if they're shown photographs, and American students tend to focus on the foreground. So how you're brought up to think and experience the world is something that's culturally instilled. It even affects your visual perception. It comes down to that. So it's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah.
To me, I was so obsessed with the content of consciousness that I was not really that aware of who is aware of all of it. And then that was a paradigm shift for me to realize it's the same consciousness everywhere, really, the omnipresent consciousness. And the content, it comes and goes. It's like watching your own movie or watching the movie of the world, and you're like in a balcony seat, realizing who is this awareness that's aware of. It's consciousness, not the content. And that's what I take from your teaching as well.
Yes, and I would call that the practice of inquiry, where you turn attention back to see what is the source of this awareness, this consciousness, and you learn to ignore the content, which fascinates us for various reasons, and it's not easy to do. One of the things anybody can try is sit down for, say, just 3 minutes and don't pay attention to any thought that arises. It's very hard. But you know why it's hard is because all the thoughts, 99% of our thoughts are about us. It's about me. I call it the story of I. So if you are, it's like being, sitting in a room and you're trying to meditate and people in the next room are talking about you. It's extremely difficult to ignore. Well, your own mind is talking about you. And it's very difficult. So this is why they have these practices of meditation where we focus on just the breath or something like that. It's to train attention to be able to let all that go. Not necessarily get rid of it. You're right, the content comes and goes. Who cares? But if we can see what it is that knows this content, now we're starting to talk about Gnosis. We're getting close. Yeah. Let me also say one other thing that Robert brought up. He said he had an experience of this. I think every human being has had at least a kind of a taste, although it may be somewhat veiled or may not last long or whatever. Because first of all, this is, of course, the truth, the mystics claim, of who we are all the time, everywhere. We don't have to really go into some special state. If it's the truth, it's always the truth, eternally the truth. But if you've ever been so absorbed in some activity, like singing or dancing or writing, or usually some creative activity, where you forget yourself. You forget who's doing this. It's just happening. And there is no sense of division between subject and object, self and world. It's just all one dance, one experience. That's starting to get in something you could look at in your own experience, that what mystics are talking about. And then you might ask the question, and usually for most people that's a very pleasant, blissful even experience, although for some it can be scary, but usually it's blissful. Why isn't that your experience all the time? Why should we be confined to some serendipitous moments in your life that you say, wow, what was that? I wish that could be all the time. Maybe it is the truth all the time. Maybe that's actually what's happening. You are not doing anything. Life is living life. And you are just, one of the waves on the ocean. Yeah.
Well, prior to your experience, your everyday experience, what is the main difference in your everyday experience before you had that hotel room, motel room thing, to after you had the motel room? And if we did the same thing, how would it be different for you?
I can go back to an example I used tonight. When I went back to New York, I took my wife back to New York. I said, we're going to go down to the old neighborhood. I'm going to show you Little Italy. We're going to, this is where I grew up and all that. And we get down there, and I'm going, I can't believe this. I can't believe this. Look at this. They've ruined it. It's all gone. And she looked at me, she said, will you stop kvetching? And I said, I like to kvetch. And the point is, I was enjoying it. I wasn't feeling, I didn't go through all that, nostalgia people have, and then raising questions about my mortality, and do you know what I mean? This is the river of life. And it's just, so now there are Japanese people speaking Japanese. It's just as exotic, you know what I mean? To me, as growing up with an American. So the difference is, there is no difference except that it's appreciated, rather than being thought of as some error here, some mistake, something's going horribly wrong, oh my God,
Is there any difference in your level of suffering?
Yes, I don't suffer. I feel pain, I feel sadness, I feel anger, I feel all the things that you feel, but I don't suffer from it. And I'll give you another good example of that. We in general, for instance, let's take emotional suffering. I mean, there's a range of emotions that we do not want to experience. We do everything to avoid. We don't want to feel sad. We don't want our cats to die, our loved ones to die. We don't want to feel anger, like at least too angry that we're out of control or something. We don't want to feel fear. That's a big one. We do everything we can avoid on some fearful situation, all this. So we don't want to experience any of these emotions. That's half of life. That's half your emotional life. And by the way, emotion comes from the root word motion, and that's what emotions do. They're always moving, do you know what I mean? So you can never get rid of them. All you can do is try to box yourself into a little fortress, so stimuli won't arise in the environment that would cause these unpleasant emotions. Now, however, all of you, do you like the movies? Does anybody here like the movies? Do you like plays? Yeah, go to plays, movies, watch TV, dramas on TV and stuff like that. What are you paying money for? I worked in the film business. You know what we used to call it? Orchestrating the emotions of the audience. And the richer the range of emotions a movie can pull out in you, and the more powerful the emotions, the more money you're going to pay me to make that movie. And these emotions include sadness. We used to have I was mostly in film, but I worked in some movies for TV, the sickness of the month, the TV movie. So somebody's dying of leukemia, they're dying of this, they're dying of that. It was a standard, it becomes just a staple. Oh, here's another sickness of the month. What do you got this time, guys? Oh, that'll be great. Haven't seen that before. I like to talk about, what was that? Titanic, the last version of Titanic. Multi-million-dollar blockbuster, and do you know why? Teenage girls went back time and again to see, what's his name? I can never remember. DiCaprio. Sink down at the end into the icy waters, and she's holding out her hand. Oh, boo-hoo. Tell all their friends, and they go rushing back to get a boo-hoo experience. Most of us are probably too mature here. We like our movies more than one note, but movies like Friday Night Chainsaw Massacre, Kill All, they run on fear. It's one emotion, to get that adrenaline going. So people go to, so they're paying good money, what? To experience all the emotions that we don't want to experience in, quote, real life. Why? Because we think they're happening to us. But supposing they're not happening to us. Why shouldn't we appreciate life the way we appreciate art? You see what I'm talking about? A great work of art, you don't go back and say, well, I wish they'd changed it. I wish she hadn't died in the middle of it. That was terrible. And then there was that awful war and that book that Tolstoy wrote, War and Peace. I mean, you should have taken the war out of that, And it doesn't mean we shouldn't participate either. We are not just witnesses. We are also actors in this. So, it's not a teaching to sit back and say, well, it's all inevitable, it's all going to happen anyway, so you might as well just grit your teeth and bear it. No, you don't like what's going on in Iraq, go out and protest, write letters, do what you want. You're an actor. Throw yourself into your role. Don't hold back. Completely. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes?
Do you relate Gnosis with the undoing of the ego?
Well, that's one way to put it, and that's a good way to put it, and it's the way it's put a lot, and that is the work of the spiritual path, you might say, if you want to put it that way. But ultimately, it's not about undoing the ego. Ultimately, it's about seeing that there is no ego. There's nothing to undo. There never was.
Also, do you see a danger or a concern, let's say, of dissociating when one has Gnosis? After Gnosis, one feels dissociated from the world, from others.
That's exactly the opposite of what Gnosis is. Gnosis is there's no separation between you and the world or others, so there could be no disassociation. But I do think it is a danger on a path for when people mistake what's going on. And also, when people look at a spiritual path as a way of escaping suffering in the sense that they're going to somehow insulate or isolate themselves from any possibility of suffering. And one way to do that is to, disassociate yourself. And there's a very important term you'll find in all traditions, detachment, practice detachment, practice detachment. Unfortunately, it's come to mean in our language, emotional detachment. And I'm not willing to give up the word detachment because if you go read any tradition, anything, you're going to run across it. But we got to remember that detachment is not about, being so emotionally detached that, there's suffering going on all around you and you've risen above it all and whatever. That's the ego's ultimate dream. It's in its fortress and nothing can touch it. So this is why all the traditions also teach very important is the cultivation of compassion, where you open to suffering instead of turning away from it. Then you open to other people and all that, precisely to counteract that tendency to withdraw, to become disassociated. But no, I think people on the path, there is a danger that people can get into states of disassociative states, sometimes quite serious psychological ones and whatnot. But it's not Gnosis, has nothing to do with Gnosis. Yes?
So is Gnosis always sudden?
Yes.
Can it be gradual?
I have never run across a case of it being gradual or read about it being gradual or anything like that. And I can give you a good reason. It's a reason intellectually, because it is outside of time. Time is imaginary. So you can't get from time to timelessness gradually through time. There has to be a leap. So my teacher, Franklin Mary Wolfe, used to draw on the little blackboard. He'd draw a line, and he'd say, and above the line is enlightenment. Below the line is thought. And he was a big believer in using thought, by the way, as a stepping stone, as a finger pointing to the moon. Philosophy. He was a philosopher and stuff. He'd say, but it's like halving the distance. So, thought can take you half the distance between here and enlightenment, and then half the distance again, and then half the distance again, and then half the distance and half that. But you can never actually get there. At some point, there has to be a leap over the line. That leap is the thing. But it doesn't mean that a spiritual path that unfolds in time isn't very rich with lots of insights, lots of experiences, and that you can gain a tremendous amount of freedom short of enlightenment through insights, through experiences, where you just see this one particular addiction that you have. So you see what it is and you drop it and you're free of it. You no longer worry about it. I was addicted to, this glamorous Hollywood life and money, and I wasn't so interested in fame. I didn't really want my name up in lights, but I liked everything else about it. I mean, I was not liked, I was addicted to it. And long before my awakening, I saw that this was futile. I was never going to become happy this way, and it's actually making me miserable. So I became free of all that, by just seeing through its true nature and observing and being mindful of what I was on a treadmill. I buy a new car. It was so exciting, a brand new car. Drove it off the showroom floor, an Audi. It was when I was a junior executive, just coming up in the world, First brand new car I'd ever had. I've been a hippie and all that. I always had secondhand cars that, break down on you and this and that. Wow, this is beautiful. And warranties up the wazoo, so, if something did go wrong, you didn't have to mess with it. And you just took it to the shop. And after about 3 months, I wrote about this in my book. I'm driving to this meeting. I'm all worried about the meeting. What's going to happen? I'm not even aware I'm driving this car that was so thrilling and exciting. And right there, I realized if I wanted to get that thrill back, I'd have to move up in the world. I'd have to get a Mercedes or something. And that same thing would happen. Then I'd have to get a Maserati or, something. There's no end to it. No end to it. There really isn't. Yes?
This question kind of has to do with the issue of free choice. And I heard what you said earlier about once the fruit ripens, it doesn't get immature or whatever you call it. It doesn't reverse. But I don't mean to make this sound like a stupid question, but I think it raises kind of interesting thought process. Can somebody who is enlightened then choose to become not enlightened?
I never got a question like that. Someone who's enlightened, can someone who's enlightened choose to become non-enlightened?
I know, somebody told me, what a stupid question, because who would want to choose to become unenlightened?
No, I tell you, it's not a stupid question, and that's not the right answer. There is no one to choose, is the answer. So you can't. See, enlightenment, this is my definition, one of my definitions. Enlightenment is the realization that there is nobody to be enlightened. But, and this is the important corollary, there's also no one to be stuck in delusion either. So there's no one to be enlightened, there's no one to be deluded. So I know it doesn't, the question doesn't make sense from the point of view of enlightenment. Would you choose? Who are you addressing the you to? I mean, maybe you're addressing it to God, and in that sense, if we want to start talking more poetically and metaphorically, yes, God, of course, chose to be unenlightened so God could play hide and seek and go find him or herself. I mean, that's one way of describing this world of delusion, right? And it only works, hide and seek only works if you're truly hidden. Right? When you were a kid, when you play, if you began to suspect your parents knew where you were and you weren't really truly hidden, that's the end of the game, then you're growing up now. But it's when you're truly hidden that the game works.
It also seems like a way of trying to prove to yourself that that, like, for lack of a better way of saying, God is unshakable, meaning you can't shake it off. So you choose to go the other way and you see it.
Actually, one of my students that woke up, her first thing that she said that gave me a clue what was happening with her, she said, "You can't get away from this, can you?" And all your life you're trying to find it, and she suddenly said, "I mean, you couldn't get away from, even if you wanted to, you couldn't get away from," which maybe is your answer. One thing, I guess, yes, when God's awake, the one thing God can't do is become deluded. But when God's deluded, God can't.
But it has a good sense of humor.
God has a wonderful sense of humor, believe me.
Thank you.
Okay? Yes, okay.